So let's talk about the psychic horror at the very heart of the swarm with a review of the Synaptic Nexus detachment for Codex Tyranids. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of the Synaptic Nexus. In my opinion, one of the most interesting out of the entire new Tyranid detachments, a very different way to play them compared with the invasion fleet, and I think it's really quite a nice one as it's maybe not quite as prescriptive as to which units you need to take, like a few of the others that are built around very certain models in the army. In the video, we'll talk over the detachment, its core special rules, stratagems, and enhancements, a selection of the most notable units, and one army list that's done well in a tournament recently. In its field lore and aim, the Synaptic Nexus is meant to represent basically the heart of the hive mind's local command and control structure as a Tyranid swarm makes planetfall or overcomes a system. Tyranids are generally directed by the synaptic web, giving the lesser organisms instructions and overriding their instinctive behaviour. This disturbing psychic command and control exists throughout every Tyranid force, but this one represents the very eldritch, disturbing cosmic horror heart of the Tyranid army. Horrifying leader beasts exuding waves of psionic energy, oppressing the enemy's very souls and spirits, and the air crackling with warp lightning, which can be used to rend apart the toughest of foes and defences. Feels quite cool imagery, and I think it will be quite a good fit for representing Hive Fleet Kronos, the Tyranid psychic and range specialists that are often employed by the hive mind to seek out, destroy, and consume the forces of chaos. Codex Tyranids hasn't been out for all that long yet, but I feel like this one is definitely shaping up to be one of the strongest detachments out there. The vast majority of the rules that it brings are really quite interesting. I feel like the core buffs are pretty handy as they're relevant to a lot of Tyranids in the army and not just a subset of units that you need to build around. It means that you can afford to use really quite a good chunk of the codex and feel like they're quite well supported. Their stratagems enhancements are really quite nice, particularly Irresistible Will to focus some big rerolls and get some big damage out of the army. And in terms of early game data, it seems to be having a better win rate than most of them. I guess it's going to be one of the stronger ones along with Vanguard, Onslaught, and Invasion Fleet. The core rule for the Synaptic Nexus is Synaptic Imperatives. Choose an army-wide special rule at the start of the battle round, and it applies to all Tyranids within Synapse range of your army, each being used once per battle. It really does feel like it has the flavour of the old Synaptic Imperatives from previous Tyranid codexes. This feels like it's the detachment to represent them. The choices that you have are a 5+ invulnerable save, which is pretty great extra defense for just about anything that it can apply to. It's going to be extra nice for any Tyranids without particularly good saves. Things like Gaunts and Tyranid Warriors would definitely thank you for that, but it's definitely pretty solid on things like the 3+ save monsters as well. Things like Haraspexes and Exocrines are going to be a lot more indomitable to overcome if they've always got a reasonable chance to shrug off something powerful like a Melter Shot or a Las Cannon hit. I think that's a pretty reasonable one to deploy early in the game, probably on the first turn that your Tyranids are going to be taking some fairly heavy damage from the enemy army, potentially even turn 1 if you get first turn and you're moving up into the open. Otherwise, the second one is a +1 to advance and charge, which seems like the one that you'd go for when any of your swarms are trying to make combat that turn. I feel like this one is probably the weakest of the three, really. It is going to be a big deal if the +1 to advance gets you onto an objective, or the +1 to charge makes the difference between passing and failing a charge. I feel like the chances of that happening, though, are at least slightly slim. Could be one of the most useful things for trying to make an 8-inch charge out of Deep Strike or Reserve. Could be a good one to use if some of your units are trying to charge out of reserves at some stage. Finally though, and perhaps the other really quite strong one, is a +1 to hit in melee, just all around strong and makes the army into actually a surprisingly melee capable one. I feel like a fair bit of the supporting stratagems and things that it has tends to be a bit more around the psychic bugs and maybe a little bit more in ranged attacks, but this one's going to be pretty brutal when the nids get into melee. Having things like Haraspexes and Maliceptors and things hitting on a 2+ rather than a 3 is definitely going to be felt. Overall solid rules, the invulnerable saves and the +1 to hit in melee are definitely going to have a good impact if used at the right time. Moving on to the stratagems, and the Synaptic Nexus has 6 of them. For 1 CP there's one called Smothering Shadow. This one's an opportunistic damage dealer when an enemy fails a battle shock test. If they fail that test within 12 inches of a synapse organism in your army, then you get to roll 6d6 for that enemy unit, and each 3+ gives you a mortal wound, so averaging 4 wounds overall, though it could swing one way or the other. Like just about anything tied to Battle Shock, this one's going to be unpredictable. Any one enemy units might always just pass that Battle Shock test when you really want them not to. But this will be quite fun just every so often when you get to inflict some random opportunistic wounds on the enemy. I guess it's most likely to happen on the turn that you use Shadow in the Warp if you happen to be fairly well engaged with the enemy army at that point. Could be kind of interesting for anything that allows more Battle Shock test or Battle Shock out of sequence, maybe even things like the Haruspex in melee. Sometimes this could be really powerful. For 1 CP, there's Synaptic Channeling. This one gives you a command phase buff where you get a 9-inch synapse range for this turn. Normally it's 6 inches, so that could be good maybe if you have some of your monsters shot out from under you and you need to have one cover really quite a large area of the board. In general, I'd kind of hope that that would normally not come to that. Hopefully you can largely avoid having to use this one via positioning. 1 command point per turn just seems a bit pricey and not something that you'd want to go out of your way to use unless it's utterly critical. Next up, perhaps one of my favourite stratagems out of any of them in this detachment is Irresistible Will. This one is quite a big damage dealing one. You can use this either in the shooting or the fight phase. You select 1 synapse unit in your army and 1 enemy unit within 24 inches of it, and until the end of the phase, any Tyranid units within 6 inches of that synapse organism get 2 reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 against your target. Normally that's going to be quite a powerful damage increase, generally around about plus 36% damage if you didn't already have rerolls from somewhere. And at that kind of increase in threat, I think it's both usable just for buffing 1 single unit if it's a big nasty one, though it's going to have most value I think if you can get lots of units focusing fire on 1 enemy. Say for example if you use it to buff an entire battery of zoanthropes with their pseudo las cannons firing at the enemy targets, that could give you some very efficient anti-tank firepower. It could just be good as a straight up damage dealer in combat though. I feel like for 1 CP, it's going to be quite good even on just single big melee units that you might have charging into combat. Say for example, a Norn Emissary with all the attacks it gets, getting reroll 1s to hit and wound against some Terminators or Space Marines or something. It is also a battle tactic, so it could be given out by Hive Tyrants to those that need it. And I feel like this one's going to be an absolute staple stratagem of the detachment, used just about every turn. Next up, we've got Reinforced Hive Node, which I think is quite good as well. 1 command point to worsen AP by 1 when a synaptic unit is targeted, and this one lasts until the end of the phase. Kind of like Armor of Contempt for select Tyranids pretty much. In general it's going to have some of its highest value if you use it on a 2+ save unit that would otherwise have taken AP. Something like a Hive Tyrant or a Norn Emissary or Assimilator might be one of the best targets there. For 1 command point we've got Imperative Dominance. This one gets activated in the command phase and it basically allows you to put 1 Tyranid unit that's in synapse range of your army into one of the different imperatives. It means that everything that's covered by the synapse web is always going to give you the option for a pop-up 5+ invulnerable save for a turn, or a pop-up +1 to hit in melee. I feel like both of those are okay, but maybe not super standout for 1 CP. I guess the melee thing could be kind of good for a really big threat like a Haruspex or maybe Old One Eye. The invulnerable save could be okay if say you've got a big swarm in the midfield that you want to make as annoying to kill as possible and it's just absolutely critical that they survive on an objective. Could be a fun way to make Neurogaunt just properly annoying to remove I suppose. Finally for 1 CP we've got Override Instincts, fallback shoot and charge for a unit within synapse range, really powerful flexibility there and maybe one that's quite nice for ranged units in particular. Most of the time Tyranids can't fall back and shoot. Could be nice if something like some Zoanthropes or an Exocrine get locked up in combat that they really can't afford to stay in. And could be pretty scary if you've got a really big melee threat that's been tangling with something of the enemies, just to be able to waltz out of combat and deal with something else that's perhaps more painful for the opponent to lose. Overall, I feel like between all of these, it's really quite a nice supporting package of stratagems. Irresistible Will, I think, is perhaps my favourite and most reliable one that you could use just about each turn. Otherwise, most of the rest are situationally useful, and you just have to look out for targets to use them on in the right circumstances. Plenty of them worth a CP, though. For the enhancements for the Synaptic Nexus, they have 4 like the rest. For 10 points there's Power of the Hive Mind, which is Psyker only, and it's a buff that's only really all that good on the Neuro Tyrants, as it improves psychic weapons. +1 strength gets you to strength 6 on its torrent attack, and extra AP gets you to AP -2, so putting it together you get a rather brutal Neuro Tyrant with its psychic flame weapon, 2d6 auto hits at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, that'll certainly scream to death some Space Marines. I'd consider that basically auto-include pretty much. For 30 points there's a Psychostatic Disruption one. This one's 30 points for messing with enemy reserves. You can't set up units within 12 inches of the bearer, and you get a 4+ chance to delay a reserve unit's arrival from strategic reserve for a battle round. Usually that's going to be a coin flip chance of delaying them coming on from Battle Round 2 to Battle Round 3, though occasionally it might be relevant for some units that could arrive Battle Round 1. Some armies have special rules to have that kind of ability. Overall, it's kind of an interesting dual purpose one that could be annoying against the right enemy army, though it's going to feel underwhelming in some games where the opponent just doesn't choose to use any reserves. That'll be 30 points basically wasted. If you are playing an army that knows it wants to be using loads of reserves though, then that could be kind of painful. The delay bits does only apply to strategic reserves though, and not deep strikers. Next up, for 20 points, we've got Synaptic Control. That's a Synapse unit only, and it's a nice -1 damage to the bearer. For the cost that Hive Tyrants are, that's really quite tempting on them to keep them just a little bit safer. Still probably doesn't quite get them to being overall super durable units, but could try and make them into a bit less of a weak link in the chain. Could also be kind of fun if you wanted to include a Turvagon supporting a bunch of Termagants maybe. -1 damage on that great big bug is going to make it a lot more annoying for enemies to try and take off the table. Finally, for 15 points, we've got the Dirge Heart of Kairos. This one's 15 points for a -1 leadership debuff within 9 inches. Handy enough to have, I suppose. Again, it's always just a little bit unreliable to invest too heavily in Battle Shock, but I guess it gets a bit more interesting in this detachment where you've got the option to hand out a bunch of mortal wounds if they do happen to fail, and you might be able to get some stacking chance or increased chance of failing Shadow in the Warp if you've already got a Neuro Tyrant on the board. Out of these, I feel like the power of the Hive Mind is basically almost auto-include on a Neuro Tyrant somewhere in the army. Synaptic Control seems pretty excellent on something like a Hive Tyrant or maybe a Turvagon. Psychostatic Disruption seems pretty good depending on how many reserves you're expecting to see in the meta, particularly strategic reserves. The Deep Strike Denial thing is pretty powerful just to deny enemies getting too close to a point in the first place though. I'd say the reserves thing and the Dirge Heart are probably the two more niche picks out of the set though. For notable units for the detachment, it's definitely going to be Synapse units all the way. As you can probably tell, I do think that the Neuro Tyrant is a pretty ideal fit for this one. It feels like a detachment almost made for him. It can spread Synapse out to units within 18 inches range with its Synaptic Relays. Could give the army a lot more flexibility on the table. That the leadership debuff with Shadow in the Warp could give you a better chance to trigger the Mortal Wound stratagem occasionally. And as mentioned, its awesome enhancements to get a big Psychic Scream that's 2d6 Strength 6, AP2 and Damage 2 auto hits is amazing, and that's a legitimate threat for overwatching if the enemy wants to move on to objectives. Zoanthropes also feel like they're particularly good for the detachment. 110 points for 3 of them, and you get the Neurothrope included, with their choice of flavours of Warp Blast, either with the sort of las cannon shot out to 24 inches with lethal hits, or the more infantry killing one with D3 shots and D3 damage. The 24-inch range really does make them feel like they're pretty well cut out for the focused rerolls type stratagem. Rerolling ones to hit and wound is good on an already a fairly efficient unit, and as well as just being synapse organisms in general, good for the various stratagems that they've got, and giving synaptic buffs to other things nearby. Otherwise, the two Norns, both the Emissary and the Assimilator, seem pretty good for the detachment as well. They're the biggest and mightiest single synapse creatures around with a whole load of damage and defense, so any of the stratagems are going to be super effective on them. With a 2+ armor save that they have, I feel like the reinforced hive node stratagem is pretty good on both of them, particularly if they can get cover, and perhaps even particularly more so on the Assimilator, which doesn't get the invulnerable save. Extra durability for that one seems like it could be a very nice thing to have, as it's so much more destructive against enemy heavy hitters. Perhaps one of the only major downsides is they lose out a bit on the detachment +1 to hit in melee, as they already hit on a 2+. Finally, for mainline units, and perhaps a particularly good use of the Irresistible Will stratagem for the rerolls, are the Maliceptors. Again, they've got powerful psychic shooting, and if you could have focus fire with a couple of these perhaps, or some of these and some Zoanthropes, you're going to be getting a lot more damage rerolling all those ones. While they're perhaps a little bit more shooting than they are melee, they could certainly be helped out by the +1 to hit in combat as well. And fallback shoot and charge could be quite nice for them. I feel like they're a unit that's fairly likely to get charged and maybe have the chance of surviving on the front line, given their debuff to enemy melee attacks coming in at them. Otherwise, I feel like there's really quite a lot of other units that you could talk about in detail for this detachment. Besides all the choices that are just generically strong for Tyranids, I feel like Warriors might have a better place here than in some of the detachments. They've got a good combination of Synapse going for them and low saves, particularly if the points costs ever go down for them, then they could be pretty key. A Hive Tyrant or maybe a Swarm Lord with some Tyrant Guard seems quite good for a big scary Synapse unit to support with Stratagems, particularly the worsening AP one, but again that could be nice for Irresistible Will in combat. I probably want a few dedicated melee units as they get quite a lot out of the core buff. The Haruspex seems like a good contender there, liking the invulnerable save, bonus to charge, and the hit roll when it gets there. Old One Eye could be another one maybe. Anything with leadership manipulation could be somewhat fun for the Shadow stratagem. The Screamer Killer could have a bit more value here. Death Leaper could force some more tests, and he's great anyway. And Haruspexes trigger some Battle Shock in the fight phase. And I'd also be tempted by some Swarms as well. Again, they like the core detachment rule really quite a lot, perhaps particularly Hormagaunts here, with a 5+ invulnerable to cover them as they move up, and then melee support things. And having a bunch of chaff Neurogaunts running around spreading Synapse could be quite nice. If the opponent doesn't deal with them early enough in the game as well, you could just absolutely mob an objective with loads of them, and then trigger a 5+ invulnerable save for a CP. That looks like it could be seriously annoying to scrape off a point if the enemy's resources are a bit depleted. Overall, the detachment definitely seems pretty solid, encouraging a few supported melee units and building around some small fire bases, perhaps with Zoanthropes or Maleceptors, and triggering Irresistible Will. It does seem to be quite a positioning critical army, with making sure that everything is Synapse covered at all times, though given the amount of Synapse units that are quite well encouraged by this, it's probably not going to be too hard. I'd be tempted to use the 5+ invulnerable save early in the game, and then the +1 to hit in melee turns 2 or 3, whichever turn you're most maximally going to be engaged in combat on, and then fit in the +1 to advance and charge somewhere around that. Maybe even turn 1 if you think you're going to be fairly safe. A +1 to advance could get you going a little bit faster. Finally, just for one example of an army list that uses the Synaptic Nexus, here's this army by Manic Gudimani, who's already managed to place fairly highly at a small grand tournament, using the Synaptic Nexus to take second at a tournament called Showdown at Frogtown. Leading the list is a Hive Tyrant with Synaptic Control. That's the one with -1 damage, which seems sensible. Old One Eye for a big scary melee threat that does quite well out of the detachment stratagems. A set of 3 units of 3 Zoanthropes, which would make good use of Irresistible Will, I suppose. 2 units of fast-moving gargoyles for objective type things, a Biovore spawning some spore mines, and a single unit of Rippers, both of which can be quite good for secondary objectives. A pair of Neurolictors, which are just generally good, and occasionally might be able to get a +1 to wound on a certain enemy target, and then a fairly big battery of scary damage dealers. The new Norn Emissary could be a powerful thing to put on a midfield objective, have some fairly good melee things, and make good use of the stratagems. 2 Exocrines for some fire support, which could be buffed by the reroll 1 stratagem, and 2 all-round solid Maleceptors. Lots and lots of synaptic goodness going here, as you'd expect, plus a few fun support units with lone operative Neurolictors, high objective control gargoyles, and secondary support from the Biovore and Rippers. Definitely looks like it's playing to the strengths of the detachment. In any case, let me know what you make of the Synaptic Nexus detachment, and what units would you be most tempted to run with it in 40k at the moment. If you'd like another video to watch, then feel free to check out my one on the Assimilation Swarm. That should have gone live on the channel already at this point. I'll try and remember to link it down in the video description, though it should be quite easy to search if not. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe for more Tyranids content. I'm sure I'll have plenty more to talk about. I do tend to post new 40k videos just about every day. I'll hope to make a few more of these detachment reviews for the swarms. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.